Live from Ann Arbor, Michigan, this is Veterans Radio. And now, here's your host, Dale Throneberry.
How are you? My name is Dale Throneberry, and I'll be your host today on Veterans Radio, remembering that Veterans Radio is radio for veterans by veterans. And I think we've got a really good show going for us this morning. We're going to be talking about ethics, morality, and war. When is it okay to shoot the bad guys, and when is it not okay to shoot the bad guys? And I've got a great guest coming on. Her name is Dr. Shannon French. She's a professor at the United States Naval Academy, and she teaches classes in ethics and war, and I think it'll be fun to talk with her and have a discussion on it. And I invite all of you out there as we get along further into the program to give us a call at 877-573-7825. That's 877-573-7825. We're going to be talking about a couple of news events today and get a little recap of Ken's trip to Washington last week with the Pride flights. But first, I've got a couple of news articles for you. And just briefly, I got them off the wire this morning. Number one came from the Washington Post. And it says the headline is, the VA doubles disability aid for an Iraq war veteran. And just this last week, the Department of Veterans Affairs doubled the disability benefits of a West Virginia soldier who had been fighting for more compensation since he returned from Iraq. The veteran is a Army Specialist Troy Turner, who suffers from PTSD, and his family, due to his lack of income and the inability to hold a job, had gone into repossession of his cars, was in ready to lose his house also. But after an outcry from people, after an article showed up in the Post, the VA actually showed up at his door, and within 90 minutes his benefits had gone from $1,300 a month to $2,700 a month. And his wife was so grateful because they were so afraid of, having another car repossessed. And the great thing about veterans out there is that when this article appeared in the Post, evidently, they started receiving small donations from veterans all over the country to help them as they went along. In fact, there's a story here about a woman named Evelyn Mitchell of Riverdale, Maryland, who sent two $25 gift cards with a note in honor of my late husband, who was a World War II vet. This is a gift to you. I think that's incredible, don't you, Ken?
Yes, I do. And you hear that more and more all the time, veterans helping veterans.
It's a theme, and in fact, I think we're going to be doing a show later on in November about that.
Yeah, we are, as a matter of fact.
Yes, I thought so.
Funny you should mention that. It's a good lead-in.
I thought so. So tell me, last week we talked with you on the phone before you took off for Washington with your Pride and Honor flight. Tell us a little bit about that.
The trip was great. It was a long, very, very long day. We left here, Domino's Farms in Ann Arbor at 4:45 in the morning for the flight to Washington, and we didn't get back here until almost 10 at night. So it's an extremely long day. But I got to tell you, these World War II vets, almost to a man, stuck through the whole day. They went to everything. And on the plane, they were still animated. It was just, to me, it was amazing. Here these guys are, in their 80s, and I'm tired as a dog, but they're still going strong. It was great. It was a good trip. Good trip. I had one interesting experience at the World War II Memorial. I was walking around looking at the memorial, and I saw a young lady in her late 20s, early 30s, and she had tears streaming down her face. And I stopped her and I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "Oh, I'm fine." She said, "My grandfather died in World War II. I wish he could have seen this." It was so touching to me. I don't know. Wow.
Well, I can understand that, and I wanted you to also to kind of, if you could, relate this story at the Baltimore airport when you arrived there.
Well, as a matter of fact, one of the participants on the trip wrote a letter to the Ann Arbor News yesterday. But basically, what happens is when we got to Baltimore airport, I was at the very back of the plane, and I was waiting for all these guys to get off. And we had 12 or 14 wheelchair veterans, and it takes time for them. And as I got closer to the front of the airplane, I could hear applause, and I couldn't figure it out. As I got to the jetway, I looked out, and the entire waiting area, everybody in the waiting area, must have been 100, 120 people, were all standing and applauding as the World War II vets came in.
I think that would be an amazing sensation, not only for you but especially for them. Kind of their own living commercial, like the one that was that was playing with the Iraq veterans coming home.
And I mean, you saw these guys, and they had tears in their eyes. It was very touching, very touching. It was a very moving trip, one that really got to me. Most of the day. It was amazing. Faye Wisely and her crew just did a marvelous job organizing this thing and setting it all up. While we were in D.C., I got an opportunity to meet with, but unfortunately I didn't have my recorder with me, to meet with the guy that organized the first ever Pride and Honor flight from Ohio, Earl. I can't remember his last name, but we talked for quite a while. He's retired Air Force. Of course.
I should point out that I'm talking with Ken Rogie, one of our partners here at Veterans Radio, who's running our control board today, and he was able to go to Washington with the Pride and Honor flight last weekend. And I just wanted to give people out there, if you have any questions, these Pride and Honor flights come from all over the country, the different states and things, and their main website is called Honor Flight. And it's honorflight.org, and you can go onto that place and you can plug into the regional, and it will show all the different organizations around the country that will help you if you have a World War II veteran in your family, or you are a World War II veteran and you want to go, or you want to donate money, or you want to go as a guardian, as Ken did.
I got to tell you, though, the World War II veterans do not pay anything for their flight. It's totally free for them. And Pride and Honor Flight will not accept donations from them.
Wow.
That's
cool.
I think it's fantastic.
I think it's a great thing, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, over Thanksgiving, Ken's going to be doing a program about his trip to Washington, and also with some other organizations out there that are helping veterans, not just World War II veterans, but also veterans that are coming back from Iraq and how to get to medical care and so on and so forth.
Right.
Well, I think that's great. Ken, let's go into our welcome home. Not only are we welcoming home our World War II veterans and giving them the honor that they are due, but there are other veterans coming home also.
Welcome Home is brought to you by the Marine Scholars Fund. Members of the Alabama National Guard 152nd Military Police Unit returned to Scottsboro, Alabama this past week. And on Wednesday, Senator Ted Stevens honored the 3rd Battalion, 297th Infantry Regiment of the Alaska Army National Guard. After serving a year in Kuwait and Iraq, this unit has returned to the United States. More than 50 soldiers from the 9th Psychological Operations Battalion returned to Fort Bragg after 15 months in Iraq. The soldiers, who deployed in July 2006, arrived at Pope Air Force Base. Marines and scholars with the 1st Battalion, 12th Marine Regiment returned to Honolulu, Hawaii. That's a terrible place to go back to.
Yeah, I would think.
And members of Company B, 1st Combined Arms Battalion, 194th Armor, were welcomed home Monday in Woodbury, Minnesota. Soldiers from Alpha Battery of the 2nd Battalion, 142nd Field Artillery Group of the Army National Guard returned to Van Buren, Arkansas on Tuesday after a year in Kuwait. They were greeted home by the Patriot Riders, who met them in Roland and escorted the buses along Interstate 40 to Interstate 540 and onto US 64 and the Armory. And 209 soldiers of the 399th Combat Support Hospital returned to Bedford, Massachusetts.
And we are back on Veterans Radio, coming to you from the studios of Ave Maria Radio in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and on the internet at veteransradio.net around the world. And we want to welcome you back to our program today. We're going to be talking about ethics, morality, and war. Why do we have to have a code of conduct? What's the point? I mean, if we're in a war, we're in a war. Our guest today is Professor Dr. Shannon French. She is an associate professor at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, where she serves as the associate chair of the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law. Dr. French received her BA from Trinity University in Texas and her PhD from Brown University in philosophy, and she joined the Naval Academy in 1997. Her book, which I thought was really interesting, is The Code of the Warrior, Exploring Warrior Values Past and Present. And she has taught classes in moral reasoning for the naval leader, teaches philosophy electives such as military ethics, the code of the warrior, advanced warrior ethics, and philosophy of religion, sacrifice and responsibility, and knowing your enemy. Whew. Dr. French, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
I think it's just a very timely topic. We have talked about this on our program in the past about the code of conduct and why we have that. And I was wondering if you could kind of give us a little historical background on that.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I have to do a little disclaimer. The views I will express are my own and not necessarily those of the Naval Academy or the Department of Defense.
Nor that of Veterans Radio.
There you go. Have to do that. But now to your question, the history of the conduct of war, usually people look at it and they think of the kinds of agreements that are made between nations. And that is very important. I mean, we do have the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict as we see them today, that have a history of nations coming together and saying, if we're going to fight one another, let's set certain parameters so that this war is not completely total war, that there is some limit to the scope. The problem with that is that those kinds of agreements, first of all, they are between nations. So in modern warfare, where you have us fighting, as we are now in many places, non-state actors, we don't have the sense that those old systems apply. The other problem is that those kinds of conduct of war agreements depend on reciprocity. In other words, if the other side is going to violate these codes of conduct, then you may say, well, it was a contract. You violated your end. Now we can violate our end. The actual code of the warrior, which is what I write about and what I study, is, to my mind, much more profound. And it doesn't come from lawyers or politicians. It comes from the warriors themselves. And it has more to do with what is honorable and what is dishonorable conduct in the eyes of those very warriors. And it has to do with protecting the warriors themselves as they go into these incredibly difficult situations where they have to make split-second decisions, and give them some guidance so that they don't judge themselves to have crossed over critical lines and become murderers or monsters.
I think that's a really important distinction to make, because we all of us, I think, that went through the military at one point or another, we had to study the code of conduct. Mm-hmm. And, then when you get into a war-type situation, it kind of goes out the window sometimes, and you have to rely on your own moral base to decide whether you're going to cross that line or not. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have so many people out there suffering from psychological problems when they get back, because unfortunately maybe they cross that line and they're trying to figure out how to deal with that. Would you agree?
Well, I absolutely agree. And the trouble is that post-traumatic stress and its various versions, which are so damaging and can actually give lifelong problems for some folks, those can occur whether it's a case of intentional crossing over the line. By that I mean where you basically reach a point and you decide to throw the rules out the window, and you intentionally say, I'm not going to try to sort out who's a combatant or a non-combatant. I'm just going to use the expression, I'm going to kill them all and let God sort them out. Mm-hmm. But it also happens for the vast majority of cases of civilian deaths where it isn't that kind of an intentional thing, but it's a mistake. It's a tragic accident. It's a case where you did everything you were supposed to do to determine whether your target was legitimate or not, and for whatever reason, and sometimes through the actual intentional choices and actions of the enemy, you killed civilians. You were tricked into it, or you had no way to judge who was at the other end of the bullet that you were sending. That kind of case, those cause severe trauma as well. So I guess my point there is it's hard enough and can be traumatic enough when you have a code to follow. It becomes just worse and unbearable when you don't even try.
I think what's interesting, and I was reading your bio and some of the information on your text, is that this is your first book, I believe it was, The Code of the Warrior, right. And I know you've got another one which we can talk about in a little bit. But you go back and you talk about the history of these codes of conduct, all the way back to the Greeks and even the Vikings and the Romans and things. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about the derivation of that and where that came from, when we decided to fight by the rules?
Oh, absolutely. And what I find very fascinating, and the reason I've enjoyed my research so much, is that there is quite a lot of commonality among these different warrior cultures, no matter how far back you go in history or where you look anywhere around the globe. And I think that is because the experience of war, even though technology's changed, the raw experience of war is itself pretty common, pretty similar, again, in any century. So you can look back at the Greeks and you find them wrestling with some of the same issues that our troops are wrestling with today. And the example that I like to give is that when you have someone who is asked to fight to defend their community, their tribe, their clan, whatever, they are being given a special status. They're allowed to do things that if they did in the ordinary life that they led before, they would be thrown out of that society. You are allowed to kill. You are allowed to use certain weapons, etc. So once you give someone that special status, you place this unique burden on them. You say, okay, we're going to let you do these things. But because we all know these things are normally beyond the pale in our society, it's up to you to draw the line so that you don't become someone who can never fit back into the society that you defended. And so if you go back again any far distance into the past that you want to, you find warriors wrestling with, how do I do what I need to do to defend my community and not become someone who, after it's all over, is basically a danger to that same community, someone who can't enjoy what I defended, and someone who might even be dangerous to my family, the people closest to me. If you look at the wonderful ancient war epic, the Iliad, which I write about in my book, you have the character of Hector, who loves his family, loves his wife and child, and yet when he's on the battlefield, he's as vicious and effective a killer as any of the other warriors. So he has to find a way to be a warrior one moment and yet not sacrifice so much of his humanity that he can't go back and hug his baby son and love his wife.
I think that's an issue that many veterans deal with. We're talking with Dr. Shannon French of the United States Naval Academy, where she teaches courses in ethics in war and how you make those determinations of what is right and what is wrong in our own lives. If you have a story that you would like to share with us on Veterans Radio today on this topic, give us a call at 877-573-7825. Dr. French, I was wondering if I was thinking of some of the people that we've had on our program in the past, and we've talked to them about the issues of coming back to civilian life and the difficulties that they have had assimilating back into that, because especially maybe not, it's got to be the same for every war, but I was thinking of the Vietnam War, where we would leave Vietnam and we would be home in our own house within 24 hours. And some of the problems that would come about when, you're on a knee-jerk reaction overseas and then you're home and people might say something and people would react to that.
Yeah. Well, I actually think the older cultures seem to have had a better handle in some cases on the importance of the warrior's transition. I mean, if you think about it, we understand, we clearly do, in all of our branches of the military, that you have to get someone geared up and prepared before you send them to war. We have, whether it's basic training or whatever type of training that we give different people in the different branches, we have a clear understanding that you can't just grab someone off the street and throw them in the midst of war. And yet we don't seem to understand that the same thing works in reverse. You can't just grab someone out of war and throw them back into their ordinary civilian life and expect that transition to work. Now, I think that some cultures had rituals that were linked to their religions that were very helpful. They had, for example, the Native Americans and some of the Plains tribes had purification rituals involving sweat lodges and other rites that gave the warrior a time to reflect on what he had done in war and a chance to symbolically feel cleansed of the ugliness of war before returning to his family and being gentle again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not unique. You find that in the Romans. They had purification rituals, and interestingly, some medieval knights, when they returned from combat, had special forms of penance that they did that were not seen as punishment, but they were seen as a chance to delay a little bit that return to their family and do something positive, acts of atonement that would make them feel more fit to be with their family, because regardless of how noble their service may have been, they could still feel tainted in some way. And what matters is their feelings, not something we impose from them externally. So I think we've kind of lost the understanding of that, and I hope now we're starting to see some people realize that and bring back some warrior transition programs. The best example is the Marine Corps, which now has a program actually called the Warrior Transition Program.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know, because I know that sometimes when the troops are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan now, there's usually a week or two before they actually get home.
Mm-hmm. And
I'd probably, I'm sure, trying to get them to come down a little bit from that emotional high or experience that they had, and try to come back into a real life and, not react quite as quickly as they would in a war-type situation.
And a lot of it is awareness. I had the opportunity to work with the Navy and Marine Corps chaplains, both in 2004 and 2006, and I learned so much from them. And one of the things that we talked a lot about is that just letting our troops know, giving them a chance to look at the experience of other warriors. You mentioned in the earlier segment, veterans helping veterans. This is a case where that could be so profoundly useful. If they can talk to other veterans about that transition, if they can just talk to other warriors who've seen what they've seen, then they realize that what they're feeling is normal. That to come back and to still feel like your head's on a swivel and you can't drive straight down a highway because you think you have to zigzag because you did in Iraq, or you can't look at trash on the side of the road and not think that could be an IED. That those feelings are completely normal and they will fade with time. That can actually be essential knowledge. Without the understanding that it's normal to feel this way, their feelings that are hard to deal with as they are get compounded with a kind of panic. They think, am I freaking out? Is this something that I should be worried about?
No, I totally agree with that idea, because the thing is that if you do sit down, if you get the opportunity to sit down and talk with other veterans, you do find out that you're more normal than you think that you are. And that unfortunately, it seems like the military kind of puts a little stigma on that. If you did want to go to some sort of group meeting and, just shoot the breeze and come out of there, usually you feel a little bit better.
And I find that it's helpful in my classes when my students read about these ancient cultures that understood that the warriors needed a little psychological and also spiritual help coming back from war. When they read about that, it adjusts their thinking, and they think, wow, that's not a wimpy or non-masculine thing to be concerned with. It's something we sort of forgot. But these cultures that you associate with ferocious warriors understood that the warriors had to make this transition, and that they can't be expected to just flick some kind of switch and suddenly they're civilians again.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your class, when you're dealing with the younger generation in this case, what kind of issues do you have with them regarding ethics?
Well, I would say that the most pervasive problem is a kind of moral relativism or situational ethics. It's very troubling to me because you get folks at the academy who have already got a lot of their moral development behind them. A lot of that happens when you're kids, of course, and by the time we get them, much of their character is formed. And don't misunderstand me; these are wonderful men and women, and I'm honored to be teaching them and to be working with them. But nevertheless, I do see, and even the 11 years I've been there, I've even seen a bit of a shift, more of them having a reluctance to pass any kind of moral judgment, whether on themselves or others. And that's what I mean by kind of relativism. They want to say, well, in that situation, it's okay, or, well, if you felt that way about it, or who am I to judge? Mm-hmm. And I guess I'd like to see a little more of the moral absolutes coming through here and there.
It's interesting. We've been following a case of some Marines that I believe it was in Haditha that were involved in a confrontation and ended up killing some Iraqi civilians. And everybody so far except for one has been released, I guess. But one of their commanders, a Lieutenant Colonel Chisani, is still on trial for supposedly covering up what had occurred. And it seems like nobody's stepping to the front and saying, listen, here is the moral dilemma, here is the solution, instead of trying to find some scapegoat out there to blame on it.
Well, I agree, and I think in cases like Haditha and other instances where we think possibly some of our troops may have done the wrong thing, one of the problems I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I believe that people forget that you can condemn an action and still offer redemption to the individual. It doesn't make you some vicious person, some heartless person, if you draw the line and say that action was absolutely wrong. You can then move from there to, now what do we do to these individuals? Do we look at whether we put them in a situation where they were very likely to do something wrong? Did we not give them the training they needed? Did we not give them the support in this context that they needed? You can look at those mitigating questions after the fact, but it's very important to draw the lines clearly. And the reason for that is, to my mind, you're making it harder for the next group if you make the lines blurry, because they have to make these difficult decisions. And if you've said, well, it depends, and I don't know, then they don't have the kind of guidance that they ought to be able to count on.
We know that, or at least stories that we have heard of people hesitating when you get you're in a situation where somebody shoots at you and you hesitate before you shoot back and end up getting killed or wounded or something along those lines. And I think that you just touched on that, of where is that line? Where do we make that decision? We're coming up on the bottom of the hour, and I'm going to ask you to hold on as we come around. But I want to remind everybody out there that we're talking to Dr. Shannon French, who is a professor at the Naval Academy in ethics, and we're trying to figure out exactly, just have a discussion on, do ethics play a part in war, really? Should they or should they not? And I encourage you out there to give us a call if you've had an experience where you've had to make that tough decision during your tour somewhere at some point or another. And our number again is 877-573-7825. You're listening to Veterans Radio. We'll be right back after these messages.
The Medal of Honor is the highest award for valor in combat given a member of the Armed Forces of the United States. There have been over 3,400 recipients of the nation's highest award. This is one of them. Air Force Captain Lance Saijan, after being unconscious for 48 hours, waved off his rescuers because the enemy was too close to him. Details after this. While on a flight over North Vietnam, Saijan ejected from his disabled aircraft, suffered a compound fracture of his leg, and successfully evaded capture for more than 6 weeks. During this time, he was seriously injured and suffered from shock and extreme weight loss due to lack of food. After being captured by North Vietnamese soldiers, Saijan was taken to a holding point for subsequent transfer to a prisoner of war camp. In his emaciated and crippled condition, he overpowered one of his guards and crawled into the jungle, only to be recaptured after several hours. He was then transferred to another POW camp where he was kept in solitary confinement and interrogated at length. During the interrogations, he was severely tortured. However, he did not divulge any information to his captors. Saijan lapsed into delirium and was placed in the care of another prisoner. During his intermittent periods of consciousness, he never complained of his physical condition and on several occasions spoke of future escape attempts. Saijan died in a North Vietnamese POW camp. The Medal of Honor series is a production of Veterans Radio.
We're back on Veterans Radio, and we're talking with Dr. Shannon French, a professor at the United States Naval Academy, where she works in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law. And I'll bet most of you civilians out there didn't know that the military studied leadership, ethics, and law. And I encourage you to give us a call if you have a question for Dr. French at 877-573-7825. Dr. French, I was reading the article that got me all interested in talking to you from the Chronicle of Higher Education. And in there you mention what we might fear is that we're encouraging young warriors to study warrior traditions of the past that will lead them to become Rambo-like or to embrace outrageous bigotries and out-of-date ideals. And the reason that line stuck with me is I can remember when I was going through basic training and they taught us hand-to-hand combat, and the first thing that they taught us was how to rip a guy's face off. And I thought, wait a minute, this is not John Wayne. I had this image, of what I was supposed to be doing, and I was wondering, how do you feel that the media may have affected our newer military personnel?
Well, of course, now, today, in addition to films and TV presentations of war, they also have these video games.
Right.
And so they are getting... I guess what worries me the most is with the video games, they have the sensation of shooting and killing people without any of the psychological or emotional realities attached. So it can promote a kind of moral numbing, if you will, that they just don't associate death and killing as they should with the end of individual human lives. But they also still have movies that glorify war and skip over some of the hardships that we've been talking about, which don't prepare them and don't get them to be thinking about how they will handle their own transitions and how they will help their troops. I mean, one of the things that is unique about where I teach is they're all going to be young officers. So they're going to have subordinates who are looking to them for guidance as well. So I have to think about that as we talk about these topics. I think that when they look at the cultures of the past, interestingly, what they pick out is not so much the what I referred to in that article, the sort of Rambo-like kill, 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 but they do pick out the fact that these ancient warriors talked a lot about honor and did seem to believe that there was a way to cross a line and no longer be a warrior. I find it very fascinating that my midshipmen, who have certain rules and regulations there at the academy, they look at these ancient cultures and they feel like their current culture doesn't restrict them enough. They say that, look, here's a case where if a Roman soldier fell asleep when he was supposed to be on watch, his fellow legionnaires stoned him to death. It didn't take some outside force. It was, you have violated the sacred duty of looking after us while we sleep, and we don't trust you anymore, so we're going to eliminate you ourselves. And they start talking about how these old cultures actually had very high standards. And, of course, you always find people flouting those standards in any tradition. But the fact that they had them and in some cases did enforce them inspires them to think in terms of, well, who do I want by my side? Who do I want watching my back? And maybe rather than just thinking in terms of kill, 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 I need to think in terms of, who do I trust and what kind of character produces that trust. If I could share one thing, my course would not work if I were not able to do one essential thing, and that's bring in people who have seen combat. And I do that as often as possible. And what I find is that they reinforce, without any prompting from me, they reinforce the idea that you have to actually have some respect for your enemy. You can't just be some kind of sadist who enjoys killing, and that those kind of people who do enjoy killing for its own sake don't belong in the military.
Shannon, I got a question for you. You mentioned about the children and the games that they play now, the killing without how can I say repercussions?
Yeah, consequences.
How does that play out with the young people that you're teaching today? Do you see any symptoms of that?
I'm afraid I do, and I think the best example I can give is actually another person that I bring in to speak to or had brought in to speak to my classes who had seen combat. He was a fighter pilot who had flown in the beginning of enduring freedom over in Afghanistan. And I brought him to speak to my troops basically about that point because it was something that he had worried about in having commanded pilots. What he did was he brought a video that showed a lot of, neat explosions. And he played it, and initially it was like a video game. So the students sitting there in class are watching this, what turned out to be actual footage of him, hitting and bombing places, and they would cheer every time there was an explosion, just as you would in a game or movie. And he played along with this for a while and let them have that natural reaction, just, wow, cool, that's awesome, look at us blow stuff up, ha-ha. And then he slowed down one segment, and it was in infrared, and he pointed to some of the smaller objects in the infrared, and he said, now, what are these smaller objects here? And eventually one of the students would say, people? Yeah, that's right, he would say, and then he'd point out that one of them was giving a much hotter signature than the others and was moving around the screen very erratically. He said, well, why is that one so much hotter than the others? And eventually, after a little pause, one of the students would say, because they're on fire? And then he would just fix them with this incredible look and just say, that's right. You've been cheering. I lived this. That is a human being writhing in agony in flames, and I caused that, and I have to live with that. And he would go from there and talk to them about consequences. And his point was not that we shouldn't fight, that we shouldn't do some of these things that must be done, but that you have to look it in the face, and you can't pretend that these are just blips on a screen.
That's a very powerful story. I'm talking with Dr. Shannon French, United States Naval Academy, who teaches ethics and leadership there, and we want to get your comments. So give us a call at 877-573-7825. I thought one of your other assignments that I was reading about was very interesting when you asked your students to write a paper on what their moral values were and what the ethics of war were and so forth, and that they, many of them came back that was wrong to kill innocent people and so forth. But then you turned them around and said, okay, now you are the other guys, the bad guys in this case. What are your moral values here? Where do you stand on these issues? And I wish you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, you mentioned that I've taught a course called Know Your Enemy, and I think that it really is essential, and all of the folks who study the psychology of those who fight come to the same point, that it really is important to understand as best you can the people that you are fighting. First of all, you have to understand that they are not animals or monsters, but that they are humans, and acknowledge that you are taking human life, because someday you will realize it, and better to acknowledge it sooner rather than later. But it's also very helpful to pause and consider why they might be acting the way they are, what their motivations are, and have that in mind as you judge your own or moderate your own reactions. And I find it very useful to do this exercise where I ask them to, kind of creepy, but I ask them to kind of get in the mind of a terrorist and imagine what would motivate them. And one of the things that we recognize in that exercise is that you can imagine someone having been convinced that if they feel some kind of revulsion or horror at what they're about to do, that's just a form of weakness, and that their duty requires them to overcome that weakness and do what's been asked of them. So rather than being completely heartless and just inhuman, they've been persuaded to ignore part of their humanity for the purpose of their duty. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't do that exercise to make them sympathize per se with the terrorists or think that that's okay, but for them to realize that what's going on in the mind of your enemy is more complicated than you might have previously thought, and to respect that allows you to still do your job and kill them, but to do it without an overriding hate that can actually damage you. I mean, they're the ones I care about. I don't care about the terrorists. I care about my students.
Right.
And I don't want them going into a war thinking, I hate and I'm killing monsters, because, boy, there is so much evidence that is damaging, that if you come out of a war feeling that you weren't fighting humans, that you were fighting subhuman vermin or something, somehow that strips it of some of the sense of honor. It removes, if you can say it this way, it removes some of the humanity from war itself. War is inhuman, but it does have that struggle of man against man aspect to it, and you want to retain that. And the ones who have the best recovery from post-traumatic stress are the warriors who are able to, on some level, still respect their enemy. It's a very fundamental level. You still say what they're doing is absolutely wrong, but you can still see them as human and perhaps understand how they came to do the wrong thing.
Right. We're going to need to take another break, and we've got a caller on the line that we'll get to as soon as we get back from this next commercial. You're listening to Veterans Radio. We'll be right back in just a moment. And we're back on Veterans Radio. We're talking to Dr. Shannon French, professor of ethics and leadership at the United States Naval Academy, and we've got a call from James in Fort Lauderdale. James, welcome to Veterans Radio. You had a question?
Good morning. Thank you for having my call. I thought the conversation was very interesting. I did want to pass up the opportunity without some sort of comment.
Yes.
But I'm a Marine, and I was in the first Persian Gulf War. And I noticed that the doctor was talking about transition programs, and that sparked my interest. I just wanted to comment that a transition program is very important because of the fact that you're just near violence all the time. And if I were to use an analogy of negative and positive feeling, just to make my argument, that there's so much negative feeling that goes on that it has to be compensated for positive feeling. And I think the way to do that when you return is to, and the doctor mentioned this a little bit concerning the Romans and their history, concerning some sort of purification or what Catholics call as penance. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that more in a way of regenerating your life by offering your services to others in terms of volunteer acts or acts of kindness toward others over a long period of time, which helps. And these things readjust the psychology and the body, the mind and the health. And it helps in terms of thinking about what you've been through and how you serve your country. Puts it all back in perspective again. And that requires time.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, James. Doctor?
Oh, yes, thank you. And in fact, just to really echo your excellent points there, I would say that I think it's a shame. Sometimes people are loath to recommend some kind of purification or spiritual renewal or any such transition for warriors, because they're afraid that it might sound like it's some kind of punishment, and it would seem like, well, here you've already given so much, now come do a service project. And it just seems, on some level, you can say, well, that's crazy. How could they serve any more than they have? But what you're pointing out, and what I've had many veterans tell me, is that it isn't a punishment, it's a gift. It's an opportunity for them to, as you put it so well, to embrace some of the positive side, the positive feelings that are also in them, and turn away from the more negative feelings that they had to be around and the negative experiences they had to go through. And so you're giving them that chance, you're giving them that opportunity to really remind themselves of the full range that they're capable of, and that, yes, they may be capable of taking lives, but wow, they're also capable of saving them, and they're capable of improving lives. And then by the end, they come full circle, and they realize that even in the process of taking lives, they were doing that for what they perceived as an end that would improve lives, so that it all, in the end, came from something positive in them, a spirit of service.
Shannon, how has the ethics of war changed from, say, World War II to the present?
Well, of course, the technologies have changed, and it's in one sense it's cut towards more precision. When you look at World War II, even though in most of our language we tend to think of it as the good war or a more morally less ambiguous, I guess, war, there was a lot of carpet bombing and use of weapons, well, even, of course, a nuclear weapon, that were very indiscriminate and killed a lot of civilians. Now we have the technology to be more precise, certainly not perfect, still a lot of collateral damage, but nothing like we saw in World War II. I think the difference of having an all-volunteer force versus a mix of volunteers and draftees is a change. I'm not sure the full ramifications of that, but someone ought to study that. That's not something I've studied. And I think also you do have this difference I mentioned before of we're fighting non-state actors, which does make it much more complicated because you don't have that reciprocity piece. You can't trust that if we treat them this way, they'll treat our prisoners that way. In fact, you pretty much have to count on the opposite, that no matter how well we hold by our code, they will not hold by a similar code and may try to use ours against us.
Well, a question that goes right along with that is that during World War II, of course, we heard the stories and things about the atrocities of the Japanese placed on our prisoners of, prisoners of war versus vice versa, the way we treated their prisoners of war. And you think that you're fighting with civilized people, but it gets out of hand, and the question of ethics and morality always seems to come into play, don't you think?
Oh, of course it does, and I think that the most profound lesson that I try to get my students to recognize and that they hear from, again, these combat veterans that I bring in to speak to them, is that you can't put your morality in the hands of your enemy. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is you can't control what they're going to do. You can't control what their values are. And so it should never be that they set your compass. If you are fighting terrorists, you know that they are going to do things that we consider very far over the line. But that doesn't justify us going over the line, because the point of our rules is to be true to our values. And we don't want to say to them, hey, you set the level, and we'll lower ourselves to your level. We can't do that for our own sakes. It's far too important, and it's not fair to our troops to ask them to become terrorists for us.
You made an interesting point right there, where we would lower our standards to meet theirs, and I think that's probably an ongoing issue with all of our soldiers and everybody overseas right now. Is I think we like to hold ourselves to a different our view of what we think the world should be. Mm-hmm. And when we run up against those issues where they don't necessarily fight the same way we do, or they're more barbaric than we think than they should be, that causes a lot of problems, I would think.
It's incredibly difficult, and that's, again, something you see historically. Whenever a culture that has more rules fights one that has fewer, or any kind of asymmetric conflict where you have guerrilla-type fighting, the temptation is incredibly strong to say, well, then let's say all bets are off, no rules. They're not fighting with rules, so we're not going to fight with rules. But historically, and certainly it's true now too, that doesn't pay off. And the reason it doesn't pay off is you're betraying your own values. And again, in the end, it doesn't matter what the enemy's doing. You have to make sure that when it's back to the transition point, you have to make sure that when you're done fighting, you fit back into the society that you left, and that it's the society that you were fighting for. You haven't damaged it too much by the actions that you were forced to take. So I think that what we look at in places like Iraq is our troops really having to put themselves at greater risk in many cases, and they do it willingly, in order to preserve our, for example, combatant non-combatant distinction. They will fire warning shots. They will do their best to try to determine whether this is a legitimate target. Do they make mistakes? Of course. They're human, and the enemy is trying to make them make mistakes, so of course they will. But that's 1,000 million times better than just saying, we're not going to try.
Right, I agree. And the other thing is that the civilians that are caught in the middle of these conflicts, sometimes it's, who are you more afraid of?
Oh, yeah.
We may I can't take that. I don't know for sure, but we may threaten them and all those other things, but the other bad guys may just shoot them.
Yeah.
to make a point.
And I think that you do see when we have reporters go in there and talk to the people, whatever their views are on feeling that it's an occupation and wanting the troops out, there is a sense of respect in most cases, and you even see that in the recent controversy of the Blackwater.
Right, the contractors.
Yeah, the contractors, who some have accused of behaving more like mercenaries and not having the same rules. That contrast only comes forward because they're used to seeing the Americans use restraint.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they would just say, well, obviously that's how Americans act. But they're not saying that. They're saying, these guys are different. Now, I don't know. We don't have all the facts in. I don't know how that's going to turn out to be judged. But the point is that to even say that we expect, these are folks who are in the horror of this daily threat in Baghdad and other parts of Iraq, who are still saying we've come to expect something else from Americans.
Right.
That's good.
It is good. It is good that we think about it. I mean, actually, that we have a thought that says, wait a minute, let's think about this for that millisecond. We've gone through another hour already, and it just is fascinating. Dr. French, I want to thank you so very much for being on Veterans Radio and offer you the opportunity. Is there any final comment that you would like to make?
I would only say that one of the great speakers that I had come in was Medal of Honor winner Sergeant Sammy Davis. And I'll never forget that he told my students that as officers, their number one responsibility was to safeguard the humanity of the troops under them.
Absolutely. On a good note. We've been talking with Dr. Shannon French, who's a professor at the United States Naval Academy in Ethics and Leadership. One book I know of is The Code of the Warrior, Exploring Warrior Values Past and Present, and you've got a new one that's called...
Well, I'm still working on that one, but
okay.
It's going to be on sacrifice, and the title may be Sacrifice in Society.
Okay. Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Dr. French.
Well, thank you, and may I just say broadly, thanks to all the veterans and all those who are serving.
Thank you very much. We'll be talking to you again, I promise.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wow, Ken, that's fascinating information, and I would strongly encourage any of you out there listening, veteran or active duty right now, to go and find the book on the Code of the Warrior. Just punch her name in. It's Shannon French, Shannon French into Google, and her articles will come up, and I think you'll find it very helpful just to you. And I know it was helpful to me too.
I think the warriors of today are really in a dilemma when they get into these situations. They don't know who the enemy is. I mean, World War II, it was pretty cut and dried. The guy on the other side was an enemy, and you shot him. But now, you don't know who your enemy is. It's similar to Vietnam, where even little kids would have bombs strapped to them as sacrifices.
That's very true. And unfortunately, we didn't know who the bad guys were, and you made mistakes. And we got to get out of here, so I'm going to thank all of our sponsors right now: Marine Scholars Fund, Quantum Physical Therapy, Legal Help for Veterans, Lynn Pitlack, Schrader Yachts, Barry Van Ness, Lilly and Associates, and Pat the Handyman. Thanks so much for your sponsorship. We couldn't do it without you. If there's anybody else out there that would like to sponsor Veterans Radio, go to our website. We'll be more than happy to hear from you. Got to remind you, next week we are going to be preempted by another program here at Ave Maria Radio, but we'll be back in 2 weeks.
The opinions expressed on this program are those of our guests and are not necessarily those of Veterans Radio or this station. Veterans Radio is a production of Veterans Radio, LLC.